In a faraway city of cold sidewalks and silent glass towers, an African boy named Tafari wandered alone. He was no older than 11, with wide brown eyes that had seen more than most adults ever would. He came from a warm village full of songs and soil and mothers who cooked with love. But now he walked the streets of a foreign land, where no one knew his name and no one seemed to care. Tafari had crossed oceans not for dreams, but for survival. He arrived in America as part of a refugee group, but somehow, somewhere along the way he was lost, left behind in the noise of bureaucracy and broken promises. Since then, the city had become his orphanage. Every bench was a bed. Every trash can, a source of hope. His tiny hands had learned to dig through leftovers, and his feet had memorized the rhythm of cold pavement. But even in his suffering, Tafari never let go of kindness. It was the only piece of home he still carried in his chest. One bitter evening, as the wind scratched at his thin hoodie and the sky turned to ash, Tafari wandered toward the city park. Leaves rustled at his feet as he scanned for food, or anything that could keep the night from swallowing him whole. And then he saw an old man, standing alone. His coat hung off his shoulders like a forgotten curtain. His hair was tangled and gray, and his legs shook with every step. He looked lost, not just in direction, but in life. People passed him by as if he were air. But Tafari stopped. Maybe it was the way the man stared at nothing. Maybe it was the way he trembled, like a branch in a storm. Or maybe Tafari simply saw something familiar, a pain he knew too well. Without hesitation, the boy approached him. He had nothing in his pocket but crumbs and a nearly empty bottle of water. But he had something else. Compassion. He led the old man to a bench and sat beside him. Quiet, steady, present. That night, Tafari gave the man the last sip of water He tore the hard crust of bread he had saved all day and placed it in the man's hands. He didn't ask for thanks. He didn't expect anything. Because for Tafari, helping others wasn't a choice, it was a heartbeat. The city lights blurred into the fog of the evening. Around them, the world kept moving. Cars honked. People shouted. But on that lonely bench, something invisible was forming. A connection not born from blood, but from brokenness, ses.taf. I didn't know the man's name, or where he had come from. He didn't ask. He just stayed, watching over him as night deepened. Even though his stomach ached and his eyes grew heavy. He thought he was just helping a helpless old man. But what Tafari didn't know was that this man was not lost at all. He was hiding. And Tafari had just stepped into a story far bigger than anything he could imagine. The morning came slowly, wrapped in mist and silence. The city yawned awake, unaware that something quiet but powerful had taken place the night before. On that old wooden bench in the middle of the park, Tafari opened his tired eyes. His tiny body ached from the cold. His fingers were stiff. But he didn't complain. Beside him, the old man still sat breathing, motionless, with his head leaning forward like a statue of sorrow. I remained there. He didn't rush away. He didn't leave him. He waited, guarding the man like a faithful shadow. For Tafari, it wasn't about being seen. It wasn't about being thanked. It was simply the right thing to do. After a while, the man slowly lifted his head. His face was pale. His eyes were red, not from sleep, but from something deeper, something that had been buried for too long. He looked at Tafari as if trying to remember how kindness felt. And for a long moment, neither of them moved. It was a silence filled with meaning, a silence that didn't need words. Tafari stood up and gently dusted off the man's coat, then handed him the rest of the stale bread he had kept hidden in his hoodie. That piece was supposed to be his meal for the day. But he gave it away, without hesitation. The man accepted it, slowly, like someone who had forgotten how to receive. And then, with shaking hands, The old man reached into his tattered coat and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. His fingers trembled as he unfolded it. The paper was yellowed with age, its corners bent, its ink faded. On it was an address, a place Tafari didn't recognize. But the way the man held it, as if it was the last thread to his past, made it clear this place mattered, without knowing why. Tafari took the paper and helped the man to his feet. Step by slow step, they began walking through the empty streets. People stared, some shook their heads. Some laughed at the sight of a little African boy guiding a man who looked like a ghost. But Tafari ignored them. He had seen enough of the world to know that love doesn't come with applause. After nearly an hour of walking, they arrived. There it was, hidden behind overgrown hedges and rusted gates. A mansion, or at least what used to be one. Its walls were covered in vines. Its windows were coated in dust. It looked abandoned, forgotten by time. But there was something sacred about it, like a memory trying to stay alive. Tafar. I helped push open the heavy door, which creaked like a whisper from the past. The air inside smelled like old wood and faded dreams, and on the walls there were portraits, dust-covered but clear. Faces of men in suits, women in pearls, and at the center, the old man himself, but younger, stronger, smiling. And that's when it began to make sense. This wasn't just a stranger. This wasn't just some poor old man who had lost his way. No, he had come home, but the question still hung in the air like smoke. Why had he left such a place? And why had no one come looking for him? Tafari looked up at one of the paintings again. And beneath the frame, he noticed something else. A newspaper framed and faded. Its headline read, "Billionaire Edward Hawthorne mysteriously disappears." And there he was in the photo, his face unmistakable. Tafari, the little orphan who had nothing, had just saved a man the world thought was gone forever. The silence inside the mansion was louder than the streets outside. It felt like time had stopped, like no foot had stepped across that dusty floor in years. The curtains were drawn tight, blocking out the morning light. Cobwebs hung in corners, like faded memories, and old furniture stood frozen in place, untouched and unloved. Tafar. I took slow steps through the grand hallway, his eyes wide with awe and confusion. Every wall was lined with pictures, portraits of wealth, of history, of a family that once stood proud. And at the center of it all, always, was the same man. The man who now stood beside Tafari, older, weaker, and broken. Mr. Edward Hawthorne, once known across the country as one of the most powerful men in business. A man whose face graced magazines. A man who vanished without warning. Some said he died. Others said he ran away. No one knew the truth. Until now. And Tafari, the little orphan boy with bare shoes and an empty stomach, had unknowingly led him back to the doorstep of his forgotten life, the mansion breathed with old secrets. Every creak of the wood, every dusty photo, spoke of a life that had been buried. Tafari explored quietly, letting the man sit and rest in an armchair that once must have felt like a throne. As he walked through a nearby room, he noticed a desk covered in letters, unopened, untouched. They were from years ago, all addressed to Edward Hawthorne. Some were business deals. Others were personal. But most were angry, demanding, cold. This was not just a home. It was a battlefield that had been left to rot. As Tafari explored deeper, he found a room that looked like a study. The fireplace was black with ash, and on the mantel sat a single photograph framed in gold. It was a family picture. A woman, a young man, and Edward himself. All smiling, but smiles can lie. Beneath the photograph was a drawer. Tafari pulled it open gently, and inside was a journal. Its pages were yellowed, but the ink still clear. He turned a few pages. There, written in sharp, lonely words, was a confession. A voice of a man who once had everything, but lost himself. He had left not because he was weak, but because betrayal had eaten through his heart like rust on iron. Friends had stolen from him. Family had used him. His empire had become a prison. So one day he walked away, not for pity, but for peace. And for years, he had wandered. Until Tafari found him. Tafari slowly returned to the man now sleeping in the old chair. He covered him with a dusty blanket, gently, like a child caring for his grandfather. And though Tafari could not read every detail in the journal, he understood the feeling, the loneliness, the pain of being forgotten. But what neither of them knew was that they were not alone. Outside, through the cracked window, a car rolled slowly past the gate. A black car, its windows dark, its engine silent. And for a moment, it stopped. Then, as quietly as it came, it disappeared down the road. But something had been set in motion. Something dangerous to Tafari had brought back more than a man. He had awakened a legacy. The days passed quietly in the mansion, like a forgotten melody slowly returning to life. Dust still clung to the furniture, and the air remained heavy with the scent of old wood and silence. But something had changed. It began with small things: warm water from the tap, a flicker of light from a lamp that hadn't worked in years, a gentle fire crackling in the hearth. Tafari moved like a caretaker, cleaning with his small hands, learning where things belonged. He didn't speak much, but his actions were louder than any words. And slowly, the mansion began to breathe again. One room at a time, it came alive, not because of money or power, but because of the presence of something purer. Care. Mr. Hawthorne sat in his old chair most days, his eyes often staring at the fireplace or into the distance. He rarely moved, but his gaze grew softer each time Tafari passed by. He had returned to the place where he once ruled, but there was no triumph in his eyes. Only quiet. Only reflection. He had chosen to disappear years ago, leaving behind boardrooms, cameras, and signatures worth millions. When betrayal crept into his family, when greed poisoned the people closest to him, Edward Hawthorne chose silence over war. He gave it all up. His fortune, his fame, his name. To the world, he had vanished. But in truth, he had simply stopped chasing a world that had turned cold. And now, fate had brought him back, not through lawyers or headlines, but through a boy with bare feet and a full heart. But not everyone was content to let the past stay buried. News of Hawthorne's return was beginning to leak into the cracks of the city. A banker noticed an old account accessed. A local newspaper received an anonymous tip. And far from the mansion, in a sharp glass tower, a man sat in a leather chair holding the same newspaper Tafari once found. He was young, ambitious, and hungry. His last name was also Hawthorne, a nephew. A man who had waited in silence for the old billionaire to be declared dead. He had tasted power in Edward's absence, and the idea that the old man had returned with a child beside him made his blood run cold. He began making calls. Quiet ones. Discreet. Dangerous. And while Tafari swept the halls of the mansion and warmed leftover soup on the stove, eyes began to follow. Black cars parked farther down the road, pretending to be idle. Men in suits took photos from across the street. The whispers of suspicion turned into the winds of threat. Tafari, unaware of the storm rising around him, continued to care for Mr. Hawthorne. He brushed the dust off photo frames, lit candles when the lights flickered, and even picked small flowers from the front garden, placing them in old vases to brighten the house. He was rebuilding something he didn't even understand. But one night, as the moon lit the hallway in pale silver, Tafari passed a cracked door and heard something that chilled his bones. Voices. Cold, sharp, speaking of things no child should ever hear. One sentence burned into his mind like fire on paper. If that boy doesn't leave, we'll make sure he disappears too. The mansion, once quiet and sacred, now held a shadow that crept in through unlocked doors. Tafa, I had saved a man. But now he had to save himself. The wind howled louder that night. Inside the mansion, Tafari moved quietly from room to room, checking windows, double-checking locks. The sentence he overheard echoed through his mind like thunder that wouldn't stop. He didn't fully understand who those men were or where they had come from, but he knew one thing: they didn't want him here. The warmth he had built with his own hands was now tainted by invisible eyes watching from the dark. Black cars parked where no cars used to be. Unfamiliar footsteps echoed across the gate at night. Shadows moved behind trees long after sunset. And somewhere in that silence, danger waited. Tafar, I said nothing to Mr. Hawthorne. The old man had begun to smile again, even if only faintly. Some days he sat on the porch with a blanket around his shoulders, letting the sun touch his skin. Other days, he watched the fireplace like it held the answers to the past. Tafari didn't want to steal that peace from him, so he stayed quiet. But his sleep grew shorter. He began sleeping near the front door, just in case someone tried to break in. He kept a flashlight under the pillow he used on the floor. And every night, before closing his eyes, he would stare into the darkness and pray for morning. The house, though beautiful, had become a battlefield again. But this time, Tafari was in the center. One morning, while sweeping the floor near the old dining room, Tafari noticed something strange. A photo had been removed from the wall. In its place was a faint outline of dust. The frame was gone. No broken glass. No fallen nails. Just gone. He looked around, his heart beating faster. He ran to the study, then the hallway, then the main staircase. And then he saw it. The front door slightly open. He hadn't left it that way. Panic set in. Tafari rushed to find Mr. Hawthorne, who was sleeping peacefully on the sofa. He was safe. But Tafari knew the warning was clear. Someone had entered, and someone had left a message. That night, the storm returned. Not with wind, not with rain. But with fire. It started small. A soft crackling behind the mansion. A flicker of orange beneath the kitchen window. Tafari smelled the smoke before he saw it, and when he rushed to the back of the house, flames had already begun climbing the walls like hungry monsters. The fire moved fast, devouring the dry wood and filling the rooms with black smoke. Tafari didn't hesitate. He ran to Mr. Hawthorne, shaking him awake. The old man coughed, dazed, barely able to stand. Tafari pulled at his arms, guiding him toward the front of the house as the fire roared behind them. Outside, the night was filled with sirens. Neighbors began to gather. Someone had called for help, but Tafari didn't wait for rescue. He got Mr. Hawthorne out into the grass, laying him gently beneath a tree, far from the fire. His hands were black with ash, his eyes red from smoke. But he was alive. When the fire trucks arrived, they found the boy sitting beside the old man, one barefoot, one wrapped in a blanket. And even through the chaos, Tafari never let go of Mr. Hawthorne's hand. The mansion burned, the past turned to smoke, but from the ashes, something had survived. Something stronger than bricks. Something purer than wealth, a bond. And as the cameras arrived and microphones began to flash, one question filled the air: who is this boy? And then, through cracked lips and a tired voice, Edward Hawthorne spoke loud enough for the world to hear. The fire was finally out, but the flames had already done their work. The mansion stood in ruins, a hollow shell of wood and ash. The memories it once held now floated in smoke above the city skyline. Reporters circled like vultures. Cameras blinked. Microphones stretched into faces. And in the middle of it all sat Tafari, silent, wide-eyed, and covered in soot. He had no idea why everyone was staring at him, but the world had begun to see. The image spread quickly. A small African boy, his hands burned and shaking, sitting beside a billionaire no one had seen in years. Edward Hawthorne, thought to be dead, returned to life, not with a lawyer, not with a family heir, but with an orphan at his side. People demanded answers. News stations told different versions of the story. Some painted Tafari as a hero. Others asked if he had tricked the old man. The questions raged louder than the fire ever had. But through it all, Mr. Hawthorne never let go of Tafari's hand. When he was strong enough to speak, he made a single statement to the press. He said the boy had saved his life. Not once, but twice. First from the cold, and then from the fire. And now, it was his turn to save Tafari. That same week, documents were filed. Legal papers, witness reports, financial transfers. The world gasped as Edward Hawthorne made it official, naming Tafari as his sole heir and legal guardian of his estate. Lawyers were stunned. Investors questioned his mind. Former relatives fumed in silence. But none of it mattered. The man who once ruled empires with his pen had made his final decision, not with contracts or spreadsheets, but with a heart finally healed by kindness. The mansion was gone. But in its place, something else began to rise. Mr. Hawthorne purchased a new home, not a palace, but a simple, quiet place with space for gardens and peace. There, he and Tafari lived side by side, not as master and servant, not as billionaire and stranger, but as something much deeper. As family born not from blood, but from rescue. Still, the world didn't stop watching. There were threats, of course. People who wanted a piece of the fortune. Journalists who dug into Tafari's past, trying to twist the story into something darker. But no matter how loud the noise became, Tafari stayed silent, steady, focused. He didn't want riches. He didn't care for attention. What he wanted was to be useful, to give back, and he knew exactly where to begin. One morning, Tafari asked to visit a part of the city no one remembered. A street of broken benches and lonely corners. The place where he once gave away his last piece of bread. Where he first saw the old man trembling in the cold. He stood there quietly, staring at the bench, and he knew everything had started here. Not in a boardroom, not in a mansion, but in a simple act of kindness no one else had seen. But someone had remembered. The city had moved on. The headlines faded, the cameras stopped flashing, and the world turned its attention to news stories. But in a quiet corner of town, something extraordinary was beginning, something that would never make breaking news, yet would change more lives than any fortune ever could. Tafari stood beneath a wide oak tree, now dressed in clean clothes, holding a small folded paper in his hand. The same paper that once carried a broken address, the one that led him to a forgotten mansion and an abandoned soul. He held it not as a memory of survival, but as a symbol of purpose. With the help of Mr. Hawthorne's remaining wealth, Tafari did not choose to live in comfort. He chose to build something. Where the ashes of the old mansion once stood, a new building began to rise. Not a palace, not a monument, but a place filled with warmth, open doors, and beds with clean blankets. Tafari named it simply, the House of Second Chances. It became a home for children who had none. For runaways, for orphans, for the forgotten. He remembered the sting of cold nights, the ache of hunger, the sound of footsteps walking past without stopping. He remembered it all, and vowed no child under his roof would ever feel that again. Mr. Hawthorne, now aging and fragile, watched with quiet joy as Tafari carried out a mission far greater than wealth. Though his voice grew weaker, his eyes spoke volumes. He had spent a lifetime chasing profits, but in his final days, he found something he never expected: peace, handed to him by a boy who had nothing. And then one evening, the old man closed his eyes for the last time, with Tafari sitting quietly at his side. There were no grand funerals, no long speeches, Just a quiet ceremony under the same tree where they had once sat together in silence. Tafari planted a small flower beneath that tree, not to mourn, but to honor. It grew slowly, fed by sunlight, rain, and remembrance. Years passed. Tafari never called himself a hero. He never wore suits or attended galas. But word of his kindness spread from street to street. The House of Second Chances expanded. Other donors joined. A movement began not of money, but of meaning. And through it all, Tafari remained the same, humble, grateful, steady. People often asked him how it all began, and he would simply point to the old bench at the city park, the one that still stood, untouched, weathered by time. Because it was there, in the cold silence of one forgotten night, that a boy with nothing gave everything. A sip of water, a piece of bread,